Nha Trang, South Vietnam, 1968. The jungle went dead silent as the search party's flashlights illuminated an impossible sight. 3 M16 rifles standing perfectly upright in the mud, arranged in an exact triangle. No blood, no shell casings, no signs of struggle. Just 3 warm rifles pointing at the stars, and their 7-man patrol had become 4. From the depths of my collection, the War Maestro brings you a tale of soldiers who ventured into the jungle hunting the Viet Cong, but found themselves being hunted by something that left no bodies to count. By late 1968, the Vietnam War had devolved into a grinding war of attrition. The Tet Offensive of January had shaken American confidence, even though U.S. forces ultimately repelled the massive coordinated attacks. Nha Trang, a vital coastal city, housed one of the largest air bases in South Vietnam, a sprawling complex of runways and hangars that served as a hub for special forces operations and aerial support throughout the Central Highlands region. Green Beret teams would launch their classified missions from here, while massive C-130 cargo planes brought in the endless stream of supplies needed to keep the war machine running. The base's strategic location made it a constant target for Viet Cong guerrilla attacks, forcing units to maintain exhausting perimeter patrols. But it was the surrounding jungle that held secrets no official report would ever acknowledge. Staff Sergeant Daniel Clay had spent 18 months in country, serving as lead radio operator for reconnaissance patrols. He'd survived the horrors of jungle warfare, watching friends fall to booby traps, calling in dust-off helicopters for the wounded, and coordinating artillery strikes against enemy positions. His role required him to maintain a constant lifeline between patrols and command, translating coordinates and casualty reports through the crackle of radio static. But nothing in his combat experience could have prepared him for what happened on the night of the 12th of November, 1968. The memory of that patrol would haunt him for decades to come, defying every attempt at rational explanation. The day had started routinely enough. Clay was monitoring communications at the outpost when radar operators reported an unusual contact, an aerial object moving erratically over the dense jungle canopy about 5 kilometers from the base perimeter. Initial assessments suggested a Soviet reconnaissance drone or experimental aircraft, but the object's flight characteristics matched no known capabilities of the time. As dusk approached, local Vietnamese sources reported strange lights deep in the jungle near the radar contact. Command tasked Clay's team to investigate, standard procedure for potential enemy activity. The 7-man patrol consisted of Clay, Lieutenant James Cooper, a by-the-book West Point graduate on his first tour, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a seasoned tunnel rat from the Bronx who'd survived over 50 underground missions searching for VC, Specialist David Wilson, a former college football star from Texas who'd earned 2 Purple Hearts, Specialist Jack Thompson, a quiet farm boy from Iowa who wrote poetry between missions, and 2 other experienced infantry specialists. Rodriguez had been telling stories about his daughter's upcoming quinceañera all week, while Wilson had just received news his wife was pregnant with their first child. They were to conduct a sweep of the area, identify any hostile presence, and report back before full dark, a routine patrol that would become anything but routine. Clay remembered checking his radio equipment one final time as the golden light of sunset filtered through the palm fronds. The jungle's familiar cacophony of birds and insects filled the air. Lieutenant Cooper studied his map, plotting their route while the others performed weapons checks. None of them could have known they were about to step into an incident that would be buried in classified files for decades. "Standard recon, boys," Cooper had said, his voice steady and professional. "We're looking for any signs of Charlie trying to set up anti-aircraft positions. Those Russian-made 23mm guns could tear our choppers apart. Keep your eyes sharp and your weapons ready. Rodriguez, take point. You've got the best eyes for spotting tripwires." He didn't need to remind them about the recent losses they'd suffered to cleverly concealed enemy positions. Just last week, they'd lost 2 men to a bamboo whip trap that no one saw until it was too late. As they moved out, Clay noticed his compass needle wavering slightly. He tapped the casing, attributing it to equipment malfunction. It would be the first of many inexplicable events that night, ones that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the nature of warfare, and what truly lurked in the shadows of that distant jungle. The patrol moved in a standard diamond formation through deepening shadows, M16s at the ready. The humid air clung to their skin as they penetrated deeper into the jungle. Clay monitored his radio, maintaining contact with base while scanning for enemy transmissions. An hour into their patrol, the first anomaly occurred. It started as a subtle crackle in Clay's headset, different from typical interference. The static had a pattern to it, almost like a code, but unlike anything he'd encountered in his communications training. When he attempted to report their position, his transmission was cut off by a sound that made his teeth ache, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. Base, this is Recon 7 over, Clay repeated, adjusting frequencies. Only the strange hum replied, growing stronger. Lieutenant Cooper noticed Clay's growing concern. Problem with the radio? Cooper asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the team had instinctively tightened their formation, sensing something wasn't right. Clay shook his head slowly. Sir, something's blocking all frequencies. And the compass. He held out his hand, showing Cooper the compass dial spinning in lazy circles, regardless of their orientation. That's when they all noticed it. The jungle had gone dead silent. No birds, no insects. Even the ever-present sound of wind through the canopy had ceased, leaving them in a bubble of unnatural quiet. The air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. Rodriguez, point man for their patrol, suddenly raised his fist, the signal to halt. Through gaps in the canopy, they could see it. A faint, pulsating glow hovering above the treetops, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. The light was unlike anything they'd encountered before. Not flares, not aircraft, not searchlights. Charlie doesn't have anything like that, Rodriguez whispered, his usual confidence wavering. The words hung in the thick air as the hum grew stronger, resonating in their chest cavities. Clay felt a pressure building behind his eyes, and an overwhelming sensation of being watched by something vast and utterly alien to his understanding of warfare. Lieutenant Cooper made a decision. We need to get closer, identify that light source. His training demanded investigation, but something primal in their minds screamed for retreat. As they advanced toward the glow, none of them could have predicted how many would return from what waited ahead, or what would follow those who did for the rest of their lives. The patrol moved forward in tighter formation, each man fighting against an inexplicable urge to run. The pulsating light grew stronger, casting shadows that seemed to reach for them through the foliage. Clay's radio now emitted nothing but that persistent hum, which had grown so intense it vibrated through their bones. 20 meters from their original position, Specialist Wilson stopped abruptly. "Lieutenant," he whispered, voice trembling, "something's moving up there." Through the canopy, the light had taken on a more defined shape, a perfect sphere that defied their understanding of Vietnamese military capabilities. The pressure in their heads became almost unbearable. Clay watched as Lieutenant Cooper raised his hand to his temple, fighting what felt like an invasion of their thoughts. The air grew thick, making each breath a struggle. Time itself seemed to distort, stretching and compressing like a rubber band. Then came the moment that would haunt Clay's nightmares for decades. He blinked just once, and Wilson, Rodriguez, and Specialist Thompson simply ceased to exist. No sound, no flash, no disturbance in the surrounding foliage. One instant they were there, the next, only empty jungle air occupied their positions. Their weapons hadn't even fallen to the ground. The remaining men froze, paralyzed by a horror that transcended their combat training. Through the disorienting haze, Clay glimpsed something that his mind struggled to process, a figure standing within the sphere of light. It appeared almost human in its basic shape, but everything else about it was wrong, in ways his consciousness refused to fully register. The entity seemed to be studying them with an interest that felt clinical, detached, utterly inhuman. Lieutenant Cooper broke the paralysis first, raising his M16. "Contact," he shouted, military training overtaking terror. The sound of automatic weapons fire shattered the unnatural silence, tracers disappearing into the light as if swallowed by some vast nothingness. The bullets had no effect, how could they, against something that defied the basic laws of reality they'd known. The sphere pulsed once, blindingly bright, then winked out of existence with an audible pop that left them staggering. The jungle's natural sounds rushed back in like a wave, crickets and birds resuming their chorus as if nothing had happened. But 3 men were still missing, and what remained of the patrol was forever changed. "Search pattern," Lieutenant Cooper ordered, his voice cracking with barely contained panic. The 4 surviving members of the patrol swept the area in expanding circles, desperately seeking any trace of their missing comrades. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but undisturbed vegetation and empty air where their fellow soldiers had stood moments before. Clay's radio suddenly crackled to life, base command demanding status reports. His hands shook as he keyed the handset, struggling to find words that could explain the inexplicable. "Base, this is Recon 7. We have 3 men missing." How could he describe what they'd witnessed without sounding insane? The response was immediate. "Recon 7, specify nature of enemy contact." The dispatcher's voice was steady, professional, a reminder of a rational world that no longer seemed to exist. "Negative enemy contact," Clay responded, watching Cooper and the others continuing their increasingly frantic search. They just disappeared. There was a light, and he stopped short as his flashlight beam caught something that made his blood run cold. 20 meters from their position, 3 M16 rifles stood perfectly upright in the soil, planted like crosses in a cemetery. The weapons were arranged in a perfect triangle, each exactly the same distance apart. Their positioning defied both physics and probability. No falling or thrown weapons could have landed this way. When Clay approached the rifles, he noticed they were warm to the touch, despite the cool night air. Each weapon was cleared, magazines emptied, as if carefully prepared for display. The ground around them showed no signs of struggle, no footprints, no disturbance in the leaf litter, just 3 rifles standing in silent testimony to an event that defied explanation. The search party arrived within the hour, bringing floodlights and dogs. The canines exhibited strange behavior, whining and backing away from the area where the rifles stood. Senior officers arrived, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. Clay watched as they conversed in hushed tones, their expressions shifting from skepticism to unease as they examined the evidence before them. By dawn, dozens of men had combed every inch of the surrounding jungle. No bodies, no blood, no equipment besides those 3 rifles. It was as if Wilson, Rodriguez, and Thompson had simply been erased from existence, leaving only their weapons behind in an arrangement that seemed more like a message than a coincidence. The debriefing began at 0600 hours in a windowless room at Nha Trang Base. Clay sat rigid in his metal chair, still in his mud-stained fatigues, as intelligence officers questioned each survivor separately. Their initial concern about enemy action quickly shifted to something else, an aggressive attempt to rationalize what had happened. "Perhaps you were disoriented," suggested Major Harris, his pen hovering above a notepad. "Combat stress can affect perception." The Major's words echoed the military's desperate need to categorize the incident within acceptable parameters. But Clay couldn't forget the figure he'd seen within the light. During quiet moments, he could still feel its gaze, clinical, curious, utterly alien. The memory surfaced in fragments, the way it seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, how its movements followed no natural rhythm. Lieutenant Cooper broke first. During his interview, they heard him shouting from down the hall, "You weren't there. You didn't see how they just stopped existing." The lieutenant was quietly transferred out of the unit the next day. The official report listed combat fatigue as the reason. The cover-up began immediately. Clay watched as the story transformed on paper. Routine patrol encounters suspected enemy ambush. 3 men missing in action, presumed Kia. The mysterious lights, the spinning compasses, the impossible arrangement of rifles, all omitted from official records. But the truth haunted Clay in ways no censored report could erase. He started noticing things in his peripheral vision, shifting shadows that vanished when viewed directly. The base's radar operators whispered about other anomalies, strange signals, unexplained aerial phenomena, equipment malfunctions that defied technical explanation. During the day, Clay clung to routine, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of military life. But at night, alone in his bunk, he felt that same clinical gaze studying him. Sometimes the low-frequency hum would return, vibrating through his bones, and he'd wake to find his compass spinning wildly on the bedside table. The missing men's families received the standard telegrams. Missing in action, presumed dead. Clay attended the base memorial service, watching as empty coffins were draped with flags. The base chaplain spoke of sacrifice and duty, but his words rang hollow against the weight of what really happened in that jungle. 2 weeks after the incident, Clay discovered he wasn't alone in his experience. It started with a chance encounter in the communications center. A young radio operator from another unit pulled him aside, speaking in hushed tones about similar reports from the DMZ, unexplained lights, missing patrols, equipment failures that defied explanation. Clay began collecting stories, carefully documenting patterns that emerged. A Marine patrol near Da Nang reported lights that called to them before 2 of their men vanished. Special Forces teams operating near the Laotian border described electromagnetic anomalies identical to what Clay's unit encountered. Local villagers spoke of ancient legends about lights in the jungle that borrowed people, returning them changed if they returned at all. The base's radar archives revealed more. Late at night, when most of the staff had retired, Clay discovered logs of unidentified aerial phenomena dating back months. Many incidents coincided with disappearances or unexplained equipment failures. The official explanations varied: weather anomalies, equipment malfunctions, mass hallucinations, but Clay recognized the pattern of denial. His investigation led him to Master Sergeant Fletcher, a gruff veteran of 3 tours who operated the radar station. "Those lights," Fletcher confided, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "They've been watching us, testing our responses." Learning, he showed Clay classified reports of similar incidents stretching back to the French occupation of Indochina. The revelation hit Clay like a physical blow. What his patrol encountered wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, one the military had been documenting and hiding for years. The 3 rifles left behind weren't just a coincidence, they were a signature, repeated in other incidents where soldiers had vanished. But his investigation didn't go unnoticed. Officers began watching him closely. His access to certain areas of the base became restricted. Warning came in the form of a late-night visit from Major Harris. "Let it go, Sergeant. Some questions don't have answers we're equipped to handle." That night, lying in his bunk, Clay heard the hum again. Through his window, he saw a familiar glow in the distant jungle. As he watched, paralyzed, a figure emerged from the shadows of his room. The same impossible shape he'd seen in the sphere, studying him with that detached, clinical interest. When he blinked, it vanished, leaving only the faint scent of ozone and the certainty that whatever they'd encountered that night wasn't finished with them. 25 years after the NHA Trang incident, Clay found himself standing in the National Archives, holding a recently declassified folder marked Project Starlight, Vietnam Anomalous Phenomena. His hands trembled as he read documents confirming what he'd suspected for decades. NHA Trang had been a hotspot for unexplained incidents throughout the war, with patterns matching his patrol's experience. The files contained grainy photographs of similar triangular rifle arrangements from other missing patrol cases. Each incident report mentioned the same details: electromagnetic disturbances, unexplained lights, and soldiers vanishing without trace. Most disturbing were the sketches from different witnesses across various units, all depicting the same impossible figure Clay had seen in the sphere. But it was a single document that finally broke him. Dated 3 weeks before his patrol's encounter, it detailed contingency plans for handling close encounters with non-conventional entities in the NHA Trang sector. The military hadn't just covered up these incidents, they'd expected them. Clay's research led him to track down Lieutenant Cooper in 1994, now a hollow-eyed man living in rural Montana. "They're still watching," Cooper whispered during their meeting. "Every night, I feel them studying us." "We weren't just witnesses, Clay, we were specimens." The next morning, Cooper was gone, leaving behind only his old compass, its needle spinning endlessly in its casing. The truth about what happened that night in NHA Trang remained buried in classified files and haunted memories. Were Wilson, Rodriguez, and Thompson truly gone, or had they been taken somewhere beyond human understanding? The military's official position never changed. 3 men lost to enemy action, their bodies never recovered. But Clay knew better. Every the 12th of November, his compass needle would begin to spin, and that familiar hum would return. Sometimes, in his darkest dreams, he saw his missing comrades, not dead, but transformed, their eyes holding that same clinical detachment he'd seen in the sphere. They seemed to be trying to tell him something, warning him perhaps, but he always woke before he could understand. In 2001, a young Army researcher contacted Clay, seeking information about the NHA Trang incident for a classified study. Clay shared everything except one detail. The night before, he'd found 3 small objects arranged in a perfect triangle on his doorstep, 3 spent shell casings from an M16, still warm to the touch, decades after the guns that fired them had stood upright in that distant jungle soil. The War Maestro's note. Staff Sergeant Daniel Clay passed away in 2004. Among his personal effects, investigators found a sealed envelope containing his final testament about the NHA Trang incident. The envelope remains classified, but sources say it contained a single photograph showing 3 familiar rifles standing upright in American soil and a shadow in the background, studying them with clinical interest. If this tale from the War Maestro's archive left you checking your compass, take a moment to join our ranks of darkness. Before you go, check your surroundings. Are the shadows staying where they should? Subscribe to unlock more classified incidents from military history's darkest corners. Strike that notification bell. You'll want to know when our next file becomes declassified. Share this account with those who understand that some war stories can't be explained by conventional combat reports. Leave a comment below. Have you or someone you know ever experienced unexplained phenomena during military service? Or perhaps you've heard whispers of other patrols that went out 7 strong but came back incomplete. Remember, some triangles are still waiting to be completed, and somewhere in the jungle, something is still watching, still studying, still learning.